6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing. You see, amazing.
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Coming up on today's Camilla Tominey show, the whole new show for GB News, we're going to be speaking to Maria Caulfield, the Health Minister, about the crisis infecting the NHS. We're also going to be speaking to Wes Streeting. What's Labour's answer to these problems? And we're going to be joined in Sydney by former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott to discuss the migrant crisis. We'll also be covering of Harry and Meghan, of course. But first, here's the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Camilla, thank you very much. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. The Prime Minister is calling on health leaders to take bold and radical action amid the ongoing crisis within the NHS. During emergency talks held yesterday, Rishi Sunak said a business-as-usual mindset will not fix the challenges we face. Many A&E units are struggling to keep up with demand, with Trust declaring critical incidents. Labour has been urged to team up with the SNP to defeat the government's plans for minimum service levels during strikes. SNP's Westminster has requested a meeting with Sir Keir Starmer to discuss policy proposals. The bill will be introduced in Parliament in the coming weeks to ensure vital public services maintain a basic function when workers go on strike. And Prince Harry has been accused of making the Invictus Games a target for extremists by revealing in his memoir that he killed 25 Taliban fighters in Afghanistan. The former head of the Royal Navy says the Games, due to be held in Dusseldorf in Germany, will now have serious security issues because of the connection to Harry. He called the Duke very stupid. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to Camilla Tominey.
Well, good morning and welcome to my brand new show on GB News. It's been a long time coming. I have to admit to a bit of nerves. However, I have been distracted all week, as you can imagine. I'm sure you know I also cover the royals as well as politics. One minute I was writing about Rishi Sunak's 5-point plan. The next I was making an analysis of Prince Harry's genitals and whether they had been frostbitten. That's the nature of the news, I'm afraid. That's what it's like from week to week. And of course, the Harry and Meghan story dominates the papers. We're going to be getting onto that a little later in the show. We're also going to be talking about the NHS because, of course, it's in crisis. You know this, we know this. We're going to be speaking to Maria Caulfield, who's the Health Minister, about what the Tories plan to do about it. We're also going to be speaking to Wes Streeting. He He's the Shadow Health Secretary, to ask Labour what their plan is. And let's also discuss migration, again, a key topic. We're going to be speaking to former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott. Let me run you through the front pages first of all. I'm going to bring in my guest in just a moment, Martin Townsend, former editor of the Sunday Express. But before we hear from him what his favourite stories are, let me just run you through some of the headlines. Sunday Times, NHS to buy up care beds to clear wards. Sunday Telegraph, Harry's guilt. I couldn't cry in public when my mother died. The Observer also goes with a story about the NHS. NHS hospitals push private route to quick and easy care. Sunday Express, my former stable. Harry puts children in danger. That's in reference to his brag that he killed 25 Taliban fighters. Sunday Mirror, Harry has made Invictus Games a target. Mail on Sunday, again, another royal story involving Harry. You've been brainwashed by therapy, William told Prince Harry. And finally, The Sun on Sunday. Wilge lunge at me after Philip funeral. This is a different argument to the dog bowl one. This involved a row that the brothers had after Prince Philip was buried. Would you believe? Now, Martin, lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you too.
Do you like this idea that I've invited in a former boss for my first show, so you can put me through my paces, as you ever did when I worked for you? You were Sunday Express editor for what, 17 years, wasn't it?
17 years,
and then OK Magazine before then.
Yes, indeed, during the golden years of the Beckhams.
The golden balls, as we like to call it.
Indeed.
Now, I know that you know your onions on this, so let's go through the papers and the stories that you chose particularly.
OK.
There is so much coverage of Harry, it's hard to pick and choose, isn't it?
Yeah.
But
Harry who, would that be?
What?
Harry who?
Yes, exactly. That shy and retiring royal
Indeed,
that went off to Montecito to live a private life. But you've chosen for quote of the day, Lord West of Spithead, former head of the Navy. Now, this is quite astonishing. He's called Harry very stupid for giving details of his Taliban kills. We can see it here in this spread in the Mirror. Why did this particularly appeal? Because it's a difficult day to get an exclusive, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, the interesting thing about the whole Harry week, which we've had this week, is that there's been sort of claim after claim after claim, and all these stories coming out. You know, we know about him talking to pedal bins. We know about him, you know, sort of cavorting with women behind pubs.
Yep.
You know, we know about him falling into a dog bowl and breaking his necklace. I mean, it's just been mad. It seems to me that most of the kind of punches aimed at the royal family haven't really landed. I mean, that's my impression. Yeah. The one line, I think, which stands out, where you would have thought someone would have said, Harry, no, don't go there, is when he said that he'd killed this number of Taliban fighters and that he'd knocked them over as if they were on a chessboard, which to me is just the most appalling thing to say.
His supporters, and obviously he's still got his cheerleaders, have sort of said this is to be taken out of context, and he said he didn't feel any emotion either way about it, and that was his job. So regardless of perhaps the nature of was he bragging or was he just telling it like it is, there's key concerns among the military and indeed royal security experts that it's not just expose his own family and the royals, but also the public. I mean, there's a coronation coming up.
Absolutely, and the point that Lord West, former head of the Royal Navy, makes in this particular piece, and the reason why I thought it was interesting, was that not only will the security have to be increased at the Invictus Games, obviously, because we saw what happened with Salman Rushdie a few months ago on that book tour.
And worth pointing out, the Invictus Games is full of ex-service personnel.
Absolutely,
so,
yeah.
You know.
But also, every event now that Harry attends, they're going to have to look at the security more carefully. And Harry himself has put himself in a position where he and his family are going to be looking over their shoulders, possibly for the rest of their lives. So, you know, it's crazy. It's absolutely
extraordinary.
Crazy.
It's extraordinary. There's so much, obviously, on Harry and Meghan, but the other theme that dominates, of course, today is the NHS.
Yes.
I mean, the crisis that the NHS faces at the moment, I know we keep on talking about unprecedented natures of crises in 2023, but, I mean, it's quite serious. And this is the leader that you've chosen, the leader page, obviously, in every newspaper, talking about what the newspaper thinks about any given crisis. This is in the Telegraph. Why did you like this? You felt this was punchy?
I just thought it was timely. I mean, Rishi Sunak today has been talking about well, both Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer have been talking about NHS reform today. I mean, I ran headlines when I was on the Sunday Express. We ran headlines every single winter talking about an NHS crisis, every single winter that I can remember. So, you know, for years, for decades. The thing I don't get at the moment is that this is specifically a Tory problem. It's not specifically a Tory problem, it's a government problem. When the NHS was set up originally by the Labour government, there was a minister who made the remark that it would work as long as people exercised restraint. Well, clearly that has not happened. You know, I think that the fact that lots of people use A&E instead of going to the doctors, that's not exercising restraint. And that there's a huge pressure on A&E and all that kind of stuff. But alongside that, we've seen that there is this reluctance to touch this sacred cow, which is the NHS.
It's like become a religion.
It's become a religion, and the point that this particular leader is making is enough.
Yeah.
You know, successive governments have failed. We know that there's nowhere for elderly people to go. If they're in hospital and they're discharged, where do they go?
Yeah.
You know, the care homes, the kind of in-between homes that my mother went into, for instance, after leaving hospital, that's closed now.
But there's I think at least 40,000 patients waiting in hospital that can't get into care.
Yes.
Just to take you on to the next piece that you've chosen, this is for your best opinion, Pete. It's Dan Hodges in the Mail on Sunday, and it's about Boris's comeback. Now, would you believe in this week of weeks, there's loads of coverage. Tim Shipman's got it in the Sunday Times about Boris. Briefly, Martin, just talk me through this story.
Well, it's based around the fact that Boris is going to be making this appearance at the Carlton Club in London on Tuesday to unveil a portrait of himself, which is a normal thing that ex-prime ministers do. And off the back of that, there is a lot of excitement around his former supporters, his former cheerleaders, about the possibility of a Boris comeback.
What do you think of the possibility?
Well, you know, I kind of get this headline. For Team Rishi, Boris is now a real threat. For Team Keir, he's the only threat.
Yes.
And I think for the Tories, he may well be the only way that they're going to win an election.
Yeah.
You
is
know,
it the case that the Tories have made a terrible mistake getting rid of this guy?
No, I think he had to go at that point. I think he really did have to go. I think it wasn't done lightly, and I think Partygate, he basically boxed himself into a corner. He was the instrument of his own downfall. But a comeback, I wouldn't write it off by any means.
No, never write Boris off, I think is the best conclusion. And then finally, best exclusive. Fears that 3 billion mini tanks won't ever be on track. What's this all about, Martin?
Well, this is an interesting one. This is a project called Ajax, which is these mini tanks. And this project originally started back in 2017. It's taken all this time for these tanks to be delivered to the MOD. They've been put into trial, and 300 troops who tried them out were shaken about so badly by these tanks that they've had to go in for hospital care. So, you know, it's one of those examples, one of the many examples I think we can see over the years of MOD sort of projects that either never happen, despite squandering billions of pounds, or just go wrong. I remember there was a gun a few years ago
that never worked.
And it's just another one of those. And I think it's just, you know, at a time where everybody's kind of in the middle of an economic crisis.
Yeah. If we've got money, can we spend it sensibly, please?
Well, indeed, yeah.
Martin Townsend, thank you very much for joining me on my first ever paper review.
Thank you.
I hope you'll come back.
I will indeed.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, there you've got the news. Now, we also want your views. I'm going to give you our news, but I'm also going to be inviting you for your views. And we've got this new concept in broadcasting called the People's Panel, where essentially we feel that political shows take too long to kind of preach at you as an audience and that you don't get to have your say. And so therefore we thought we would go to Sheffield this week and speak to some people there about what their views are about what's going on in the news, but equally for some reaction to some of our ministerial interviews. And if you want to apply for the People's Panel, you can go to gbnews.uk/panel. We've got Tom Harwood, I hope, in Sheffield. Tom, can you hear me? Who have you met there?
I can indeed, Camilla. We are here in Sheffield, specifically at the La Piazza Cafe. And if we just walk in, we do have our People's Panel waiting for us inside. They've got a lot of things they want to ask the politicians on the show today. We'll just step inside now. First, let's have a quick chat to Rebecca, who owns La Piazza Cafe. Thank you for having us, first of all. How's business going?
It's going all right, but apart from the energy bills and which have tripled over the year and the cost of living.
Yeah, no, really tough time, no doubt, but it is a beautiful cafe that you've brought us to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for hosting us. Let's waste no time at all now in terms of talking to our panel, who will be wanting to ask a number of things from the politicians today. First of all, Anne, what's the biggest issue impacting you?
For myself, it's the small boats coming across. We, the United Kingdom, we are an island. We are not going to be able to fit the amount that are coming over each year. And as I hear that you're speaking to the previous Prime Minister of Australia, he done that. It works. Why can we not adopt that same? If it ain't broke, you know. And that's what I think. Why can't we just take control of our borders?
Really salient issue. Let's speak also to Joss. Now, what's the biggest thing that's really on your mind at the moment?
At the moment, it's small businesses. We've got no confidence in the markets. We don't know what's happening. We need strong leadership to let us know what's happening. Small businesses at the moment are not spending money. They're not working together. There's no B2B trade as such. It's being impacted because we don't know what's happening.
Immigration and the economy, two huge issues. We've also got Sam, who's a young voter here in Sheffield. Sam, what's the biggest issue facing you?
The government's failure to act on all levels, essentially. I mean, we've spoken about immigration there, but the strikes as well. I mean, they're letting public service go into a state of complete disrepair without even attempting to fix it. I mean, you've got the nursing crisis now, and if we've got money to fund a proxy war in Ukraine, then we should have money to pay nurses more. And it's as simple as that. And the government have failed to act on all levels.
Really strong stuff there. Now, finally, let's talk to Phil. Phil, what would you want to ask? We've got two health ministers. Well, one health minister, one person who wants to be a health minister on the show today. What would you want to ask them?
The NHS, why don't you just all get together and have a cross-party consensus on how the NHS can be fixed? No one party can do this because you're not going to be there for longer than, 10 years at the most. We're talking about 50 years to look after Sam when he gets older. Why not have a cross-party, all agree on something, get it rubber stamped, get it in law, and then that's it, it's fixed. Because we've got now 8,000 diversity managers in the NHS. Now what do we need 8,000 diversity managers for? 50% of them are on 100k a year, over 100k a year. That's 3 junior nurses or 3 junior doctors at low level coming into 2 at higher grade. So it's, to me as a layman, it's obvious. You don't need bureaucrats and people pushing pens to run a hospital. You need nurses, doctors and the auxiliary staff.
And would everyone here agree with that? I mean, the NHS seems to be a huge issue that's affecting everyone right now. What's the biggest solution? What do you want to hear from the politicians?
To be honest with you, I can't, myself, I can't complain about the NHS. I had an heart attack in the April of the pandemic. They were amazing. I have a condition that I have to have. I've never had an appointment missed. They have never cancelled me. My doctors, if I have phoned them on a morning, I have got to speak to a doctor, and then he will decide if I need to see him. If I need to see him, he'll say, come in. So personally, I cannot say that, I have a problem with the NHS.
And yet there are some big issues for a lot of people.
Globally within the United Kingdom, yes, I can see the damage that has been done.
Well, we will be coming back to all of you after we've heard these interviews. But for now, back to you, Camilla, and let's look forward to what the politicians have to say.
Thank you so much for that, Tom. Interesting to hear, actually, what people feel outside of the Westminster bubble. Always a lot of criticism that political shows only focus on London. And clearly there's key concerns up in the north about the NHS like there is anywhere. Some of the statistics on the NHS at the moment are quite staggering. So a Commons Library report showed that NHS waiting lists for the treatment topped 7 million as of September 2022. That's up from just 2 million in 2010. We know that Keir Starmer's talked about his solutions for the NHS. We're going to be speaking to Wes Streeting about that soon. There's also other statistics to suggest that people are waiting a long time for treatment as well. So that Common Library report shows that now 45.2%, a new record high, are waiting for over 4 hours for treatment at A&E. This compares to less than 10% in 2011. What's the Westminster voting intention right now? Well, let's have a look at that, because obviously it's key critical to both parties to find out where they are in the polls. Well, the latest YouGov polling, conducted on the 4th and 5th of January, puts Labour 21 points ahead of the Tories, so they're on 46% versus 35%. And I suppose the key concern for a number of MPs, particularly Tories in marginal constituencies, is this notion that they are going to lose their seats and the NHS is going to be a key topic that's going to cost them on the doorstep. I think all of the polling consistently shows that it's the economy, stupid, as Bill Clinton's advisor once famously said, and the NHS that is really affecting people. We're waiting for Maria Caulfield to come down the line in Millbank. She's going to be with us shortly. Maria, I think, can join us now. Can you hear me, Minister?
I can, yes. Good morning.
Hello there, Minister. Thank you very much for joining us today. Look, you just heard me give all of those statistics about waiting lists. The Tories' record after 12 years on the NHS is appalling, isn't it?
Well, the UK government is only responsible for healthcare in England. These issues, whether it's ambulance waiting times or the number of beds available, are problems across the UK. So where Labour run the health service in Wales, they've actually got a worse performance in Wales. The SNP have similar problems in Scotland, and it's also the case in Northern Ireland. So, these are clinical indicators and factors, which means that we're under so much pressure this winter. We're seeing a twindemic of both COVID and flu. We're seeing over 50% increase in the number of patients in with flu at the moment. That has a knock-on effect if beds aren't available for A&E, which leads to the long waits which you describe, and then it has a knock-on effect on ambulances being stuck at A&E trying to unload their patients. So this winter is particularly difficult, and we're seeing record levels of patients needing admission.
But Minister, just saying that it's bad across the whole of the UK doesn't help the Tories' cause. You've been in power for 12 years, and the NHS seems to be in a worse condition than it was when the Labour Party left it in 2011.
Well, that's my point. We are not responsible for healthcare across the UK. We're only responsible for healthcare in England. So all political parties, if they run, Labour run the health service in Wales, the SNP in Scotland, are facing exactly the same issues. But what we are doing
it's England's
in England
numbers that are terrible, though, Minister, isn't
it? It's all numbers. Wales are in a worse position than we are, and certainly Scotland are probably on par with England, and that shows that there's clinical reasons for why we're facing these pressures. But what we are doing in England is we are creating 7,000 more beds by funding social care so that we can get patients out of hospital. In December alone, we were able to discharge over 8,000 patients who had been in hospital and were waiting to be discharged. We're opening new surgical hubs, over 90 across England, and over 90 new diagnostic centres. We're increasing the number of staff that's available as well. So there's a range of factors which are meaning that we are trying to tackle this problem.
OK, Minister, of those 40 new hospitals that Boris Johnson had promised, can you tell me where one has newly been built?
Yes, I can actually say next door to me in Brighton, we've had the new development that's almost finished. The other side of me in Eastbourne, they're going to be starting their new hospital fairly soon. And in addition to that, getting a new surgical hub, which will be completed by next year. The new hospital programme is between now and 2030. So there are some hospitals that won't have started, but there are some hospitals that are already finished, and hospitals where work has commenced. So we are serious about building those new hospitals. But that's in addition to the over 90 rapid diagnostic centres. Again, I've got one just on the edge of my constituency at the Amex Stadium in Falmer, and they're providing over 2 million new tests that patients can access that traditionally they would have had to go to the hospital for. So there's lots of investment going into the NHS that patients will start to see the difference from very soon.
But isn't it the timing issue, Minister, in the sense that patients don't feel they're seeing any difference? And the Telegraph reported in the week that only 7 hospitals, or work on 7 hospitals, had started out of the 40. You talk about staffing. We've got the NHS now being crippled by strikes. What's your position on the strikes as a former nurse? They put public safety in danger, don't they?
So the Secretary of State is meeting specifically with health unions tomorrow to discuss pay and conditions. Obviously, we don't want strike to go ahead. They do impact on patient care. They do make it more difficult for patients to get appointments, and that's why the Secretary of State is meeting with them to talk both pay and working conditions to see if we can make some progress on that. But the reality is we are putting record levels of investment into the NHS, and we want to make sure that that's going to frontline services so patients feel that benefit.
You talk about record levels of investment, but actually in the week, Rishi Sunak in his speech on Wednesday ruled out structural reform of the NHS. Why on earth would you pay more money into the NHS without reforming it, Minister?
Well, that's because we're putting money straight into frontline services right now. I've talked about the new hospitals that are being built, the new surgical hubs which are dealing with the backlog, so patients aren't waiting as long as they are at the moment to get their surgical procedures. We've got the new rapid diagnostic centres, so patients can go to a community centre in their local area to get things like MRIs, CTs, X-rays, where traditionally they would have had to wait for the hospital to send them an appointment. We've got 10,000 more nurses, we've got over 4,000 more doctors. The money is going to frontline services, and it will start to make a difference. This winter we're seeing huge numbers of flu, respiratory viruses, patients in with COVID that make it very, very difficult to see that difference. But we will get that. That's why the Prime Minister met with health leaders yesterday to see what more we can do so that patients can feel that benefit of that investment.
I know, although that Prime Ministerial meeting has been described as a talking shop. Minister, I know you used to be a nurse in the NHS. I know you got into trouble, I think, in 2017 for talking about scrapping that below inflation price cap on wages. What percentage rise would you give nurses? Would you give them the 19%? And as a former nurse, surely you'd be clamouring for that kind of figure.
Well, I still work as a nurse. That's on my declaration of interest. You can check what shifts I do, and if I'm not elected again, I will be returning to full-time nursing. So no one is more passionate about nursing than me. But we also are in charge of the taxpayers' purse strings, and if we were to give a 19% pay rise, that's over £10 billion. I think the unions recognise that, and they're wanting to discuss pay with the Health Secretary tomorrow. So I think progress.
What figure would you put on it then, Minister?
Start negotiations. Well, we're going to start negotiations with the unions tomorrow on this year's pay rise, and that will be submitted to the independent pay review body to see what they think, and that will look at things like inflation, staffing levels, retention. So I'm not going to make comment on what is going to be on the table at those discussions tomorrow. That's for the Secretary of State and for the unions to discuss.
OK, thank you very much for that. That's Minister Maria Caulfield. She's in the Health Department, and she's also, as she's pointed out, a nurse. And she will go back to nursing, she says, if she loses her seat come 2024. Well, we're going to be hearing from Red Streeting for Labour's response to the NHS crisis after this short break.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
Why not take us home with you by visiting the GB News shop at gbnews.store. You'll find all the official merchandise, a really good present actually for yourself, your friends or your family.
We ship across the UK mainland at no extra cost. GB News, the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me! And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other pay-per-review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
He's the king of breakfast TV, and he's back and returning to his throne.
This is Breakfast on GB News with Eamon Holmes and Isabel Webster. Good morning. It's my favourite.
Oh, right. Set your alarms. Eamon Holmes back on GB News Breakfast on the 9th of January at 6 a.m.
Still to come on the Camilla Tominey show, I'm going to be speaking to Labour's Wes Streeting about his party's answers to the NHS crisis. Also going to go live to Sydney to speak to former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott. And we'll be going back to our People's panel with Sheffield to find out what they think about what the ministers have been telling me this morning. But first, here's the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Camilla, thank you. Good morning. It's 10 o'clock. I'm Tatiana Sanchez in the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister has admitted the NHS is undeniably under enormous pressure. Rishi Sunak has told BBC's Sunday with Laura Koonsberg he has a renewed sense of confidence and optimism to get to grips with the ongoing crisis within the service. Following emergency talks yesterday, he's calling on health leaders to take bold and radical action, saying a business-as-usual mindset won't fix the challenges. The Royal College of Nursing has warned upcoming strikes will be the biggest ever in the industry if the Prime Minister does not negotiate on pay. The RCN's General Secretary, Pat Cullen, has told Rishi Sunak to meet her halfway to ensure the industrial action, set for later on this month, does not go ahead. The union says it's willing to consider a pay rise of 10% rather than the 19% previously requested. Labour has been urged to team up with the Scottish National Party to block the government's plans for minimum service levels during strikes. SNP's Westminster has requested a meeting with Sir Keir Starmer to discuss policy proposals. The bill will be introduced in Parliament in the coming weeks to ensure vital public services maintain a basic function when workers go on strike. Russia has bombed eastern Ukraine minutes after ending its self-declared ceasefire in the country. The governor of Kharkiv says a man died as a result of Russian shelling. President Putin ordered a 36-hour ceasefire in honour of Russia's Orthodox Christmas, which ended at midnight last night. Ukraine had rejected that truce and shelling continued along the front line. Prince Harry has been accused of making the Invictus Games a target for extremists by revealing in his memoir that he killed 25 Taliban fighters in Afghanistan. The former head of the Royal Navy says the Games, due to be held in Dusseldorf in Germany, will now have serious security issues because of the connection to Harry. He called the Duke very stupid. And one of Princess Diana's most famous dresses is set to go on sale at the Sotheby's in New York later this month. The strapless evening dress is worth between £66,000 and £99,000. Diana first wore the dress for an official portrait with the then Prince of Wales in 1991. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to Camilla Tominey.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. We've just spoken to Maria Caulfield, the Tory Health Minister. We're about to speak to Wes Streeting. We're just waiting for him to get ready. We're going to go back now to Tom Harwood, who's in Sheffield with our People's panel, to find out what they made of Maria Caulfield. I thought she wasn't really giving very many straight answers to my fairly straight questions, but I don't know what they felt there, Tom.
Yes, Camilla, I think there's a broad sense of agreement here. Let's start off with Joss. What did you make of what the Minister had to say?
I can't believe that their interest is to pour more money down the drain. The system's broken. It needs rebuilding. If this was a business, it would be out of business. The NHS foundations need rebuilding, not just pouring more and more money down the drain and getting it wasted.
Yeah, that was that important question about whether or not reform was necessary to follow all of the much more money that's gone in.
That's right, though. It needs structure. Yes, it needs the money to bring the structure to pass, but to keep throwing money at the frontline workers, it's not working. They need to change the middle management. I don't blame these nurses at all, the frontline staff. It's just the middle management, and they are the ones that are running this NHS into the ground. And I also believe as well that the Conservative Party are doing this because they eventually want £10 to go and see your doctor, £15 to go and have a specialist. They want to privatise it.
And you say that as a Conservative voter?
Yes, I'm not a Conservative voter. I was a Labour voter. I lent my vote to the Conservatives to get Brexit done. That's why I am now in the wilderness, and Reform UK is edging that bit further for me, because that is what I believe.
Now, Phil, you wanted to come in there.
I'm a Conservative voter, and I don't believe they want to privatise it. They want to streamline it. Which is what Sandra said, it's get rid of the middle management. It's them that's running the NHS, and they haven't got a clue. You want a doctor running the NHS, or the nurses. You want a forum of people.
Now, as a whole, did you think that Maria Caulfield, the Health Minister, answered the questions that she was asked?
I don't think she listened to our questions, because there was no relative answer to anything either of us have said.
What do you think? Yes, Sam.
She didn't come up with any strategy whatsoever, and this is typical. There is no outline of any kind of semblance of a plan. There's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. And we have the same with the rail strikes. They don't want to say what they're going to do. They say, "Oh, we're going to go to the negotiating table." Well, what does that mean? What are you going to do at the negotiating table? They won't tell us. They're just going to let public services be run into the ground before they do anything about it.
So a sense here in Sheffield that we're not getting those clear answers, not yet at least. Back to you, Camilla.
Thanks very much for that, Tom.
No ministers.
Thank you very much for that, Tom. A lot of concern there about part privatisation, which is interesting because my next guest, Wes Streeting, Shadow Health Secretary, seems to be coming up with a plan for Labour that involves part privatisation. Mr. Streeting, isn't this against everything the left believes?
Morning, Camilla. We're not talking about privatising the NHS, but we are talking about using spare private sector capacity in the short term to deal with the biggest backlog in the history of the NHS, because at the moment we've got a two-tier healthcare system in this country. The Shadow Cabinet fully supportive of it, but the problem we've got is we've got a two-tier system where those who can afford to pay to go private do, those who can't are left waiting longer. And going back to your point about principles, I don't think it's a principled position to leave people who can't afford it waiting longer and those who can being seen faster. So we would use the private sector capacity to bring down NHS waiting lists faster, and as with the NHS, patients wouldn't have to pay a penny. And the last Labour government did it, it was highly successful, and at the same time we made the NHS so good that use of the private sector fell because the NHS was so good people no longer felt they had to go to private. And you know, we're so far from that situation after nearly 13 years of Conservative government.
And Mr. Streeting, how do you think the doctors' unions are going to be reacting to this plan? There's a piece in the Mail on Sunday today saying that they're becoming increasingly militarised. They don't really like the idea of private contractors coming into the NHS, do they?
Well, lots of doctors do private practice alongside their work in the NHS, which is why the capacity is there. If doctors are saying they'll give up their private practice and throw all their hours into the NHS, well, that would be wonderful, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. And the point is, Camilla, that we know that whenever reform is proposed, whatever that reform is, I've been floating ideas this week around reform to primary care to improve people's access to GPs, it's always met with opposition from somewhere, and if you just give up reform because someone's opposed to it, you wouldn't get anything done. So we are having to reform the NHS. I'm afraid the public finances are in such a mess because the Conservatives have crashed the economy and actually poorly managed the economy for more than a decade now, which means that the money is scarce, public finances are tight. So we will invest in the NHS. We've committed to.
Let's talk about funding, because Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has said that you need to have more nurses, more doctors, you need reform, you need pay to be increased. But then he said this week that we can't spend our way out of this mess. So how is Labour proposing to spend? What is Labour proposing to spend, and how is Labour proposing to afford all of these reforms to the NHS if you don't want to spend any more money?
So £1.6 billion would deliver the biggest expansion of NHS staff training in history, doubling the number of medical school places, 10,000 more nursing and midwifery clinical training places, as well as 5,000 more health visitors, and double the number of district nurses so we can do more care in the community too. We would pay for that by abolishing the non-dom tax status that allows very wealthy people who make Britain their home to pay their taxes elsewhere, obviously at a much lower level. So we'll deal with that anomaly.
What's
but this is what you can expect to see from Labour, Camilla.
How much will that raise?
Well, the tax changes themselves would raise just over £3 billion, 1.6 billion of which would go to the NHS staff training programme. And this is what you can expect to see from Labour this year. Where we are proposing additional spending, we will say how much, why it's needed, and where we'll find the money. But the message that Keir has delivered this week is because the public finances are in such a mess, we are not going to be able to do everything for everyone, everywhere. And there are some things that we would probably like to do, but simply won't be able to do as fast as we would like, because unless we get the economy growing again, unless we get it working for working people, the public finances are going to be a mess. And what we don't want to do is do what the Conservatives have done, is just hike up taxes on working people. The tax burden's already at its highest in 70 years, and that's why we've got to get the economy growing again so that we can invest in our public services without hitting people with more punitive tax rises.
Are you going to cut spending?
Well, we're having to make difficult choices around spending. As I say, where we choose to invest more because it helps to deal with fundamental problems rather than take the sticking plaster approach the Conservatives had, will show how much it costs, where the money comes from and what the impact would be. But Keir said very clearly this week, we are not going to be able to get the big government chequebook out for everything because the economy is in such a mess, and we're honest about that. And I want people to know at the next election, when they pick up a manifesto, that the promises they read in there are promises that are well thought through, promises that we can keep, promises that the country can afford. That will mean some difficult choices, and believe me, as a member of the Shadow Cabinet, there are plenty of times when Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves say no to me because they've got other choices to make, because the public finances are in such a mess, and I understand that, and we want the country to understand that too.
Are you going to say no to nurses when they demand 19% pay rises? How much would you give nurses, Mr. Streeting?
Well, I'm afraid I did have to say to the nurses, however much I totally sympathise with their pay claim, I would kind of, in all honesty, Camilla, say if I was in government today, I'd be able to give them 19%. But we did say we would sit down and negotiate. I think that's what the government should do. And what I was so disappointed about before Christmas. Well, if I were the health secretary, I wouldn't be negotiating live on air, Camilla, either. And I'm not going to do that as the shadow health secretary. But we would be willing to negotiate. We would be able to negotiate on pay. I think Pat Cullen, who leads the Royal College of Nursing, offered to actually call off the strike action before Christmas if the government would only sit down and talk about pay.
Come on, Mr. Streeting, you've got nothing to lose at all in giving me a figure. Just give me a figure. The criticism of Labour, isn't it, is that it's a lot of soundbite and no substance. So come on, give me a figure. How many percentage points rise would you give to nurses in their pay packets? It's a simple question.
Well, I think I'd lose my job if I gave you a figure live on air, Camilla. I think Keir said very clearly this morning that look, we don't expect the government to negotiate live on air and to pluck figures out of the air. We do expect them to sit down and negotiate. I do understand the pressure that nurses are under, that junior doctors are under. I have to say, if I were going into those negotiations, my focus would be on the lower paid staff in the NHS, on the lower pay bands, the poorly paid nurses and the junior doctors. I do understand why, in the middle of a cost of living crisis, they are really feeling the pinch, and we've got to see this in the context of retention too. Lots of people are leaving the health service for better paid jobs elsewhere. We can't afford to lose them. We've got to take that into account as well.
Why did Labour MSPs support Scotland's moves to allow children to self-identify as a different gender? And that move, as you know, Mr. Streeting, has effectively resulted in biological men with their genitalia intact being able to go into women's spaces simply on the say-so that they've changed gender. Why did Labour MSPs support that, do you think?
Well, we wanted, obviously it's an issue for the Scottish Parliament, but we wanted the age at which people could legally change their gender to actually be set higher, and we put amendments to the bill to that effect. I think we would probably take a different approach in England, but since Scotland's gone down this route, I think we can now look and see how it works, learn from that experience, because I think that there are clearly problems with the way that the process does work as it stands today. I know that there are also lots of people who are anxious about how any system to change people's gender might be subject to abuse. We're alive to those concerns. We would want to tread carefully on this issue, treat people with the dignity and respect that they deserve. I think in the latest census, 0.5% of people in this country, so not a high proportion, but still, if you're part of that 0.5% of people who suffer from gender dysphoria, whose gender doesn't match the sex you're born into, you have a pretty torrid time of it in terms of discrimination, abuse, mental ill health. We've got to treat those people with dignity, but make sure the system works and isn't subject to abuse, and that's the approach that a Labour government would take.
Final question, Mr. Streeting. What's the Labour Party's response to Prince Harry's revelation? Time for a republic?
No, we're not Republicans in the Labour Party. Historically, we never have been. That's not to say there aren't some people in the Labour Party, as there are across the rest of the country, who might prefer to change the system. But I think the monarchy's served us well. It gives us stability. I think it is something that people look to around the world with a great degree of affection. It brings tourism to the country. And I think, for the best and worst reasons in the last year, we've seen the monarchy in its finest hour. I think for the worst of reasons, because it involved the loss of a dearly beloved Queen, Elizabeth II, but also in response to her passing, we saw millions of people taking to the streets to show the warmth and affection, not just to Her late Majesty the Queen, but to the royal family and to the monarchy, and that's a system we don't plan to change, and I don't see any great appetite there in the country for a move to a republic.
Mr. Streeting, I'm going to put you down into Team Windsor in that case. Thank you very, very much for joining me this morning. Well, that was the Shadow Health Secretary there talking about the NHS and its crisis. There's another crisis, of course, facing the UK, and that's the migrant crisis. I'm going to bring in Tony Abbott now. He was Australian PM from 2013 to 15. Let me just give you a statistic here that sums up Abbott's approach to the migrant crisis in Australia. In the first year of his term of office in 2013, there were 20,000 migrants entering Australia illegally by boat. By the end of his term, in 2015, there were 0 illegal migrant entries by boat. That's quite a statistic, Mr. Abbott. How on earth did you achieve it?
Well, we basically decided that the boats were going to stop because boats coming at that rate and people entering our country illegally at that rate amounts to a peaceful invasion. And no sovereign country can tolerate its borders being violated by people who just get on boats, land on your shores, and basically if you can get here, you can stay here. So we had to stop that. So we did a number of things. We reinstituted some Howard government's policies, temporary protection visas, offshore processing and turning boats around where it was safe to do so. But we also brought in some initiatives of our own. We had a combined command under Operation Sovereign Borders, which ended the, I suppose, dysfunction of different parts of government all doing different things and too many cooks spoiling the broth. We had a news blackout because announcing every single arrival was effectively shipping news for people smugglers. Most importantly, where the people smugglers scuttled their boats, we gave their passengers unsinkable boats and put them back on the water towards Indonesia from whence they'd come. So we had a very determined, very clear set of policies. I can't say they were popular policies. There were lots of claims that these would be against human rights. Some even said they were against international law. But we were absolutely determined to stop the people smuggling trade, to stop the deaths at sea, to keep our country secure and sovereign, and the only way you can do that is by keeping control of your borders.
Well, you talk about the lack of popularity of the policy there, Mr. Abbott. My understanding is that subsequent to you being in power, Labour then obviously took over, tried to reverse it initially, but now these measures remain in place and presumably there are now no migrant arrivals by boat in Australia. Is that still the case?
That is still the case. There was a brief flurry of activity where people smugglers tried to test the resolve of the new Labor government. But to its credit, thus far at least, the new Labor government has maintained the former coalition government's policies. But these policies were bitterly opposed by the Labor Party when we first put them forward. They were very heavily criticised from many, many different quarters while we were actually doing them, but once they worked, they suddenly became quite popular and were embraced by the Labor Party. In the end, this is one of those situations where success creates popularity, and because the policies succeeded, they were widely adopted, and I certainly think there's a lesson there and a potential model there for other countries, such as the United Kingdom, that have got a problem with illegal arrivals by boat.
What do you think has gone wrong with the UK's policy then, Mr. Abbott? I mean, you'll be aware of the legal challenges that have taken place. Do you think perhaps former Home Secretary Priti Patel was a bit short-sighted, that she didn't predict that this would be challenged in the courts?
Well, if you've got a problem with the activist lawyers bringing legal actions to try to frustrate the policy of the government, well, you've simply got to change the law. Now, my understanding is that there's no reason why the UK Parliament couldn't change the law to remove the jurisdiction of the European Court that prevented the removal of boat people to Rwanda. No reason why the law couldn't be changed, and certainly successive governments in Australia confronted with activist lawfare against the government's policy to keep our borders safe, we simply change the law, and that's what you've got to do where the law isn't working.
I just want to move on to another subject now, if you don't mind, Mr. Abbott, because I remember the last time we spoke, I think I covered a tour of Australia by William and Kate. It was when they brought little Prince George along from memory, and you were Australian PM then. What do you make of some of the revelations that have come out into the papers now following the Spanish publication of Spare, Prince Harry's autobiography? I know you know both of these princes. What's your reaction to it?
Well, Camilla, I don't really want to get into a running commentary on anything that Prince Harry has said. I just make the general observation that you shouldn't dump on your family. I know there are all sorts of issues inside families, but the last thing anyone should do is publicly dump on their own family.
And there's some speculation here, Mr. Abbott, that it might lead to calls for a republic, not least in the UK, perhaps not, because popularity for the monarchy remains about 60-40. But over in countries like Australia, where obviously there is a flirtation with the idea of dispensing with the royals, do you think that might strengthen the case or weaken it?
I think there's no doubt that whenever a sort of a soap opera quality afflicts the royal family, that tends to detract from the lustre of the monarchy. But in the end, it's the office, not the office holder, that counts. Let's not forget that King Charles, Prince William have appeared to carry themselves in an exemplary fashion through this time. They've been quite supremely indifferent, if you like, to the kind of things that are being said. And look, if you've got nothing good to say, say nothing. That's a pretty good rule, isn't it? Now, I should also say, well, Camilla, that whatever the issues with Prince Harry and his memoirs and his interviews, I think that the death of the Queen last year and the accession of the King has been a reminder of the importance of the monarchy and how the monarchy contributes to stability and continuity in government, and how the monarchy adds almost a spiritual dimension to our public life. It adds an element of ceremony and pageantry to our public life. It keeps one important part of our public life free of the taint of party politics, and I think this is the great strength of the monarchy, and this is why I hope the monarchy that we share with you endures forever.
Mr. Abbott, while I've got you, I'd like to talk to you very briefly about foreign policy as well. China, Russia, news of a meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping. Obviously, you're closer to that territory than we are in the UK. What are your feelings about the ongoing war in Ukraine, Putin's behaviour? First of all, can you envisage any kind of ceasefire there?
Look, I think there's really only one good answer, and that is for Russia to be driven out of all of the territory that's it's illegally seized from Ukraine. It's waged a war of utmost brutality. It's indiscriminately targeted civilian infrastructure, people's homes. It has killed civilians mercilessly. It's committed war crime after war crime. There's only one satisfactory solution to this, and that is the complete expulsion of Russian forces from the territory of Ukraine. And if we don't get that, that will embolden dictators everywhere, including China's Red Emperor, who obviously has cast covetous glances on Taiwan. And if he thinks he can get away with it, I certainly think he would give it a go. The heroic defence of the Ukrainians and the help that the Ukrainians have been getting from Western countries, particularly countries like Britain, I suspect are giving Xi Jinping pause in any ambitions that he might have to take Taiwan, and that's a very, very good thing.
As a former Prime Minister, what's your analysis of Putin? Mad? Bad? Both?
Well, I think that we've got to take dictators at their word. And when someone like the Russian leader says that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, when he says that Ukraine has no right to exist as an independent country, when he says that it's run by Nazis, palpably false, of course. I think we have to accept that as far as he is concerned, he wants to recreate the Russia of Peter the Great. And that means there can never be an independent Ukraine, there can never be independent Baltic states, there can never really be independence for Georgia and Moldova. Poland is under deadly threat if he gets his way, because these are all territories that for hundreds of years were part of Greater Russia, and of course most of Eastern Europe was under the thrall of the Soviet Union for about 50 years.
Mr. Abbott, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there.
There is no doubt
Thank you,
they have massive ambitions. Thank you, Camilla.
Thank you very, very much indeed for joining me in Sydney. That was former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott. Let's cut back to Tom Harwood now in Sheffield. Tom, what's the reaction there on the People's Panel?
Yeah, so many varied questions asked. Let's dive straight in. What did we first of all make of Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, on his idea about the NHS?
Well, again, there's no plan, is there? I mean, there's no strategy in place. He's talking about using the private sector. Well, that's not a long-term solution, is it? I mean, how is that going to help long-term? There is no plan of action for what's going to be paid where. There's just, oh, well, this is how we're going to deal with it short-term. Well, no one's got any clue how they're going to do it long-term. There's clearly just no strategy.
And Phil, Wes Streeting wouldn't commit to a number.
Well, I think we should go beyond the NHS now and do about immigration. We should get Tony Abbott here and the New York mayor in London, Tony Abbott on our side, telling our ministers what to do, how to do it, get out of this stupid NRTC, and we don't need it. We can make our own rules up.
A lot of agreement here with Tony Abbott. What did you make of what the former Prime Minister had to say of Australia?
I agree with every word he actually says, because he told them in Australia that he was going to control their borders. He did it. He kept people offshore. They would not let them put their feet on Australian ground.
And Joss, do you agree with that?
Totally. The Conservative Party at the moment is the New Labour. There is no difference between them. They all speak the same rubbish and they don't give a straight answer. It is constantly skirting around the issues, speaking in folk tongues, and the people are sick of this. We want a person which will say, this is the problem and this is like how we're going to fix it. We need a strong leader, such as we've not had anyone stand up and speak on the people's behalf. Well, since Nigel brought us out of Brexit.
So a lot and own it. That's what they've got to do. Say it and own it.
A lot of agreement here with Tony Abbott and a lot of mistrust of the two politicians that were on at the top of the show, and they're skirting perhaps of the big questions. Back to you, Camilla.
Thank you very much for that, Tom. I love that endorsement of fellow GB News presenter Nigel Farage, as would be expected from a GB audience. Now, after the news, we're going to be talking about Harry and Meghan, of course. But here's the headlines first with Tatiana Sanchez.
Camilla, thank you. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister has admitted that the NHS is undeniably under enormous pressure. Rishi Sunak told the BBC he has a renewed sense of confidence and optimism to get to grips with the ongoing crisis within the NHS. Following emergency talks yesterday, he's calling on health leaders to take bold and radical action, saying a business-as-usual mindset won't fix the challenges. Labour has been urged to team up with the Scottish National Party to defeat the government's plans for minimum service levels during strikes. The SNP's Westminster has requested a meeting with Sir Keir Starmer to discuss policy proposals. The bill will be introduced in Parliament in the coming weeks to ensure vital public services maintain a basic function during strikes. Prince Harry has been accused of making the Invictus Games a target for extremists by revealing in his memoir that he killed 25 Taliban fighters in Afghanistan. The former head of the Royal Navy says the Games, due to be held in Dusseldorf in Germany, will now have serious security issues because of the connection to Harry. He called the Duke very stupid. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
Why not take us home with you by visiting the GB News shop at gbnews.store. You'll find all the official merchandise, a really good present actually for yourself, your friends or your family.
We ship across the UK mainland at no extra cost. GB News, the People's Channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Now, this is the section I've been most looking forward to. It's called Generation Gap. I kind of realised, probably having debates with my dad, we're on the same side ideologically, but because of the age gap between us, we seem to disagree about quite a lot. So I thought it'd be an idea, rather than to have these debates often between left and right, to have them between young and older. And I say that with Stanley Johnson in mind. I hope you don't mind me calling you at that end of the generation gap. Stanley, author, former Conservative MEP, is joined by Iman Aiton, BLM organiser. I think we can agree, without being impolite, that there is a generation gap between you. Is that fair, Stanley?
There's an abyss.
There's an abyss. All right, well, I wouldn't put it that far, but decades perhaps. But look, let's discuss Harry and Meghan, because the polling does show that opinions vary widely depending on how old people are, and older people seem to perceive Harry and Meghan more negatively, perhaps, than younger people. Stanley, I'm going to start with you, because you're a Johnson, and that's showing it there, look on the screen. So you can see how 18 to 24-year-olds seem to favour Prince Harry much more highly, and Meghan, than, say, your 65-pluses. So the red kind of represents people who don't really like them, the purple representing people who are fairly positive about them. Yeah. And that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, that is kind of a massive generational divide. Now, Stanley...
Well, I don't want to let my side down.
No, don't let your side down. But why I'm intrigued by your response to all this is you are a member of a family dynasty, so to speak. And I just wondered what you felt about people talking about family members like this. You're used to being in the public eye, so is your family. Should this be done or not?
Do you know, my thought here, I think I'm speaking more in sorrow than in anger. That's what the headmaster used to say when he was going to, whack you at school. More in sorrow than in anger. I think it is unfortunate what has happened. I think that some things went went wildly wrong. And obviously they mentioned the number of kills, Taliban who we might have killed. That I think was a huge mistake. I think that getting that stuff out there about the fight he had with that fight, quote unquote fight, I think I minded more about the fact he was wearing a necklace.
Yeah.
And then the third point I would say is that I do feel, and you mentioned the fact that I am a family man. It's perfectly true. I do have quite a lot of children. I feel very sorry for King Charles. Obviously, he's not
as the dad in all this.
Yes, I mean, he may not be the target of the book, but nonetheless, he can see it all going on. I feel very sorry about that. And my last one is a totally frivolous one. Just, I think, really does show my generation. I do say to myself, haven't we seen enough of Prince Harry's beard?
Well, have we seen enough, Iman, of Prince Harry altogether? I know you've always been a stalwart supporter, particularly of Meghan.
Yes.
Has this made you less supportive or not?
No, not at all. So firstly, if you wouldn't mind, I'll just make a few points. So I just want to throw out there, the commercialisation of the rift was a byproduct of three main things now that we've seen the documentary. So number one was the media onslaught of abuse. Number two was the lack of support from the royal family pertaining to media abuse. And lastly was the racial prejudice within the media and the institution. Now, in terms of the whole exposing issue, I think that's natural. I think when you are silenced for most of your life, that's just a natural byproduct. When you have to suppress feelings, what you often find is they will inevitably make their way to the surface. That's just human nature. And when that is compounded by the need to defend and explain, one might find themselves exposing all sorts of truths that can offer clarity and truths that can help an individual heal. And according to neuroscientists such as Patrick Porter and Bobby Banks, the need to over-explain oneself derives from childhood trauma and gaslighting.
But is there a limit to over-explaining? I mean, is there just here, we've got sort of tales of frostbitten penises, we've got tales of losing virginity in a kind of, with a horsewoman behind a pub. Isn't this a case of too much information? I mean, you must have been cringing at some of it, Iman. Come on.
It's a lived experience. In fact, I actually felt like it made him more relatable. And I'll just make this point before Stanley continues. I think Harry's interviews, his book Spare, are vital opportunities for him as an individual, as a man, as a husband, and as a member of the royal family to take back control of the situation by exposing the truth, defending himself, and ultimately, eventually making amends. He opened up Pandora's box in defence, and so now he has to find a way to close it. And I believe him speaking up is his attempt to do so.
Stanley?
Well, I think I do perfectly, obviously, come from a different generation. My father was a pilot for 5 years during the war, but I never, ever heard him mention the war. I really didn't. He essentially had a couple of crashes. And I think that, for me, it's the perhaps lack of reticence, which is going to be the most upsetting thing about this. Now, I quite understand that exposure is all the name of the game now, but one feels that this was not really well judged. Now, there is a thought. And I'm not, I mean, this lovely lady who's here today with me, she knows much more about that. But there is a thought that maybe you explain all this in terms of what's called post-traumatic stress disorder, and this is a way of dealing with it. But I'm not an expert on this.
But is this the healthiest? You've talked about psychology there.
Yes.
Are you looking at Harry and seeing a mentally healthy man, or are you seeing somebody who's really damaged?
Seeing someone, the latter. There is no denying that this is someone that's been through a certain level of trauma. Again, the combination of the aforementioned factors that led to their depart. So, yeah, I think he's contending with a lot. So I think he is dealing with a certain level of trauma and that has affected his mental health. But it doesn't negate the fact that he is allowed to defend himself and share his lived experiences.
But do we think this is going to help his mental health in the sense that, you know, he's come in for a hell of a lot of criticism. He's been concerned in the past about invasions into his own privacy. This has just opened the floodgates.
Well, I have to say, there have been millions of people that have been speaking about this couple for years. And as far as I'm concerned, I have counted 5 retorts as of late. So we have Oprah's interview, Netflix, Anderson's interview, Tom's interview, and the book Spare. So that is 5 retorts versus millions of people, including Tom, Dick and Abdul, over a 5-year period, vocalising their half-baked opinions about the couple. So for me, there is no comparison. If anyone has an issue with them responding, I think they're ultimately just being unreasonable and likely leading with their prejudice or blinded by their prejudice.
But you say about prejudice, isn't it interesting that there isn't actually that much in the book on racism at all?
No, there isn't.
Why do you think that is?
I think this is more focused on Harry, to be honest with you. This is his moment to kind of delve into his personal lived experience. And I think Meghan, as we know, there's a book, I'm really looking forward to it, a book from Meghan, and hopefully she'll be able to delve into
Speaking of someone who has very much supported a lot of the work Harry has been involved with, because before he got involved with Invictus, and so he was very big on the whole wildlife issue, as was then Prince William.
Yeah.
These things, I think, it's really rather sad that aspect of Harry's career and Harry's importance has been slightly, as it were, derailed now by this emphasis on the inner Harry. I'm not sure any of us need our inner selves to be exposed.
Iman, you seem to be saying he should keep on speaking, and Stanley, what's your view? He should shut up.
I think, as someone said about Mr. Attlee, a period of silence might be in order.
And generally, this sibling rivalry, I mean, how have you had to deal with sibling rivalry in your own family? How do you deal with it as a dad?
My dear brother, my very brother Peter, well, that was a problem. That was a problem because I ended up in the same form as he was at school, and I was 4 years younger. So there was a problem. The problem was perhaps more on his side than on my side. I didn't think I even realised.
I was talking more about your children, actually. Stanley, Joe, Boris, Rachel. It's been in the press. Sometimes there's a bit of rivalry. Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
I have no idea how they get on. I'm sure they all get on. I'm sure they all get on fine. Very much hope so. No, of course, you could say you want to be truly cynical about all this. Maybe Harry's living out the sheer horror of his time at Eton. I mean, I'm sure he had a wonderful time at Eton, but nowadays it's better to say you didn't.
Final thought to Iman. Let's be honest, I know you're a champion of the couple, but if your own siblings did this to you, you'd be devastated, wouldn't you?
No, because it depends on if...
In the press, if they trashed you in the press,
it depends on the circumstances. So again, if I am having to defend myself, then there isn't an issue. They are the ones that ultimately fell to be anti-racist. The royal family are the ones that fell to offer that support. So what we're witnessing is the couple defending themselves. So it's not about slagging off. It's not about trying to bring down the monarchy. It's not about any of those things. It's simply just about defending.
I want to defend the quote-unquote royal family at this point. I think they have really done everything they can to support Harry. That's what I think.
All right, fair enough. Thank you very much, Stanley Johnson and Iman Ayton. Thank you for joining me for my first ever Generation Gap.
And congrats.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So far, so good, she says with her fingers crossed. Now, I'm going to be speaking to 2 people after the break that really did know Prince Harry and William very well. But let's come back in a couple of minutes.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here. You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News.
Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Welcome back. Before we start discussing the royals again, let's go to Michael Portillo, my fellow GB News presenter. Michael, what's coming up on your show today?
Well, Camilla, first of all, let me say welcome to GB News and congratulations on your first show, which I've enjoyed enormously. May I just remind people that you were right at the beginning of the Meghan and Harry story, weren't you? Tell us about your very earliest contribution to the story.
Michael, you're too kind. I was the person that broke the news of their relationship back in October 2016, funnily enough with Martin Townsend, who did our paper review earlier on the Sunday Express. So, yeah, I started all this. Not sure how it ends, though, Michael. That's the trouble.
No, but it has given you a very clear perspective and a very clear viewpoint, and I've been reading your columns, and it's great to have you speaking now on GB News. And also, referring to your programme, you had Wes Streeting on. He didn't get a very good view from your panel, but I think a lot of Tories will be thinking, why are government spokesmen not talking more about reform? Surely the time has come for National Health Service reform. And I think we're going to be continuing that theme on the show coming up. I'll be talking to Stephen Dorrell, who as a former Health Secretary has the latitude to talk about reform, and to Professor J. Marion Thomas, who's been a very outspoken critic of things that are going wrong in the health service. By the way, we won't just be talking about life, we'll also be talking about death. We've also got Professor Sue Black, who recently gave a series of absolutely fascinating Christmas lectures. She is a forensic anthropologist, so we're going to be talking a little bit about death as well as life.
Sounds brilliant. Thank you very much, Michael. Portillo's on at 11. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Elsa Anderson, the Queen's former press secretary, and Ken Worf, Princess Diana's former bodyguard. Thank you so much for joining me on this week of weeks. Let's start with Elsa, actually. Now, I'd like to know this, Elsa. When you were press secretary, why weren't you giving me loads of stories? Harry says the palace was always feeding stories to journalists like me.
Oh, well, Camilla, in the 13 years I worked in the royal household as the Queen's press secretary, there was not one occasion when I briefed against another member of the royal family to promote my own. So I'm afraid, as much as you would have liked me to have spoon-fed you all sorts of exclusives, that was not my bag.
Now, Elsie, you can't possibly be suggesting that Harry might be telling some fibs in this book.
I'm just talking about my own experiences, Camilla, and
yes.
I can again just say I never happened on my watch. And actually, the Queen wouldn't sanction it. The Queen would not want her members of staff briefing against people in her own family. That's just not on. So you would not count doing that.
Ken, let's bring you in on this. I mean, your reactions, you knew these princes very well when they were little. You saw the dynamic between them. Have you been shocked by some of the revelations?
I actually think that, you know, the book Spare, I mean, what I've read so far is actually, it's rather pitiful because I'm rather saddened by it for him. I'm saddened by it for the royal family that, you know, this is an episode, a story that they didn't need. And, you know, people talk about revelations. And actually what we're hearing is a sort of an airing of his problems publicly that include his father, that include his brother and other members of the royal family. And like any airing of anyone's problems, any chance of a reconciliation seems now to be faded fast, because if you're going to reconcile a problem, you need to do it privately. You don't do it like this. And there are so many things that have come out of this. I mean, of course, I remember them both as two very young children. And, you know, that was a very pleasant experience. You know, it was a privilege for me.
Was there this sibling rivalry from a young age?
Well, there was. I mean, I went there when Harry was 3. William was 5, 6. And Harry was always the sort of the court jester, the entertainer. And, you know, understandably, you know, in any sort of, there's always going to be sibling rivalry. And William, understandably, was a bit jealous of Harry's popularity. But that was then. But, you know, be under no mistake that even at that age, Harry, as a 5-year-old, I remember, you know, was clearly under the knowledge that he was never going to be king. I mean, there's that interesting story that I remember travelling to Highgrove one weekend, which we did, and there's Diana driving. The nanny of the late Olga Powell is refereeing this fight on the back seat. And suddenly, out of nowhere, Harry sort of leans across to William and said, "It's all right for you. You know, you'll be king one day and I won't, therefore I can do what I want."
Yes.
Now, that was a 5-6-year-old.
But you've hit on something there, because Harry clearly feels he can do what he wants. When you were working in the royal household, Ailsa, did you get the impression of this man raging against the machine? There seems to be something in him saying that he felt like he was a spare wheel to William and Kate.
I never got that impression at all. And actually, I maybe want to counter that and think, if you're not the heir to the throne, maybe that gives you more freedom to live your life.
Yeah.
You know, he wouldn't have been able to go to Afghanistan on 2 tours if he was the heir to the throne, presumably. So I think, actually, it took the pressure off him a bit while he was growing up to be that second son. And do you know what, Camilla, in what family isn't there rivalry between siblings?
Yeah.
I know myself. I mean, I'm sure you do.
But he paints this picture of people like you having to manage these complex relationships, diary clashes, personality clashes. He paints a picture of Charles and indeed William, and by association, Catherine, as being cold and unfeeling people that didn't hug. I mean, I appreciate you were staff and not family, but is that how you found these royals?
Never. And I have to say, I have been hugged by a member of the royal family before, female member.
Are you able to tell us which one?
Absolutely not. So I never found any member of the royal family other than warm, caring, considerate and helpful. I mean, it was just an honour and a privilege to work in that organisation, and I would say that for the staff as well. They must be feeling extraordinarily bruised over all these allegations. As I said, I couldn't have worked for a more professional, loyal, honest group of people. It was a privilege.
Ken, a lot's been made of this. Is it a boast? Is it just a statement of fact that he's killed these 25 Taliban fighters? I know you came into the police force as a cadet. I know you were SAS trained. I'm not sure if you've ever killed anyone, Ken, or whether you'd ever tell me. What do you think are the security implications of what he said about the Taliban?
Well, I think this is probably one of the most serious aspects of this book. And, you know, I don't think we should take this lightly. We've read over the last 2 or 3 days a number of leading military personnel that have actually condemned his actions, and I think it was incredibly foolish. Because,
does it put him and his bodyguards
at greater risk? But I think it does. I mean, let's be quite frank about this. We've already had statements now from Afghanistan, and this, you know, the sort of the popular media now. This has actually gone global, and you know, I was talking just a moment ago about look what happened to Salman Rushdie recently. Nobody anticipated an attack like that. So I think Harry now and his security, wherever that might be, seriously needs to reassess his own security and that of his family, because we live in very dangerous times. So to make that statement was an incredibly rude one to make, which brings on the question of why didn't someone really sort of advise him, go through this, prove this book, and identify the areas that were likely to cause him a problem. And that clearly didn't happen, but it was a very, very bad
Are you
mistake.
worried about the public as well, bearing in mind that there's a major royal event in the coronation happening in May?
Well, already, you know, the security arrangements of that are well underway, and that will now become part of the problem. And then it brings into question, will Harry be invited to the coronation? That we don't know exactly that. There are rumours perhaps he won't be. But you know, it will. There are serious implications of that statement that seems to me to have now dominated the world's media, and rightly so. It's put aside, you know, the fight in Nottingham Cottage. It's put aside the falling on the dog board. I mean, you know, we can laugh at that, but the actual implication surrounding the fact that he shot 25 Afghan whatever was a huge mistake on his part.
And also briefly, Ken, before I come back to you, Ailsa, you oversaw the arrangements around Princess Diana's funeral in 1997. Reflecting on it, do you think it was wrong that those princes walked behind that coffin?
Well, I think it was very difficult for Harry. But I think what you have to remember here, Camilla, is that, you know, there was what they call a sense of duty here. You know, this is what happens in state funerals for members of the British royal family. This is all part of being royal. I think personally it was probably wrong for a child of that age of 13, but it was part of his duty. Very difficult as it may be. But one thing I would like to say that, you know, there's always been a lot of criticism about his father. You know, there's no doubt in my mind, or being on the other side, as it were, working for the princess, that I always found the prince to be an extraordinary, forgiving man. And one thing that I see now is that he would like to find a way and would wish to find a way to reconcile himself.
Yeah, that's in the papers this morning,
well,
this
with his
suggestion
son.
that he
I'm
wants
sure
to
he
make
will
peace.
do. There's no doubt about that.
Very, very briefly, Ken, Diana's thoughts on this? She'd be devastated, wouldn't she?
Well, she would be devastated, but Diana herself did exactly the same thing. So, were she alive, she would say to her, look, I think you're making a big mistake.
Yes.
Listen, look what I did.
Ailsa, you worked with her professionally, you knew her well. There's been reports in the papers today and yesterday saying this devastated the Queen in her final years. I mean, what do you think she made of all this?
I think she would be absolutely devastated. What the Queen wanted was an institution to go forward, and I have absolutely no doubt the institution will go forward. This is not a crisis. I mean, we've seen an abdication in 1936. That was a crisis. This is not a crisis. This is a bump in the road, shall we say. But I do think this would have affected the Queen horribly. She'd lost her husband, who was her strength and stay, and now she's got this awful rift with her grandchildren and her son.
I mean, the people that you speak to at the palace still, I'm sure you still have friends there. Do they say that it did adversely affect her as she was in her final weeks and months, do you think?
I think it would be something certainly discussed, and you can see whether it was her lack of mobility, but in the last year or so of her reign, she was winding down. She was not doing as much as she did previously, and I think this family row, blatantly public family row, was bound to have an effect on her mentally and physically.
Thank you very much, Ken Wolfe, Ailsa Anderson. Very grateful for your views this morning. Thank you for tuning into my first ever show. Please do tune in next week. Thank you very much for having me, and have a great weekend.
I'm Mark Dolan. Join me at 11 on GB News for Headliners, in which I'll be joined by two of the UK's top comedians discussing tomorrow's papers. If it's an important story, we'll cover it, but we'll have some fun along the way. Headliners, the late night paper review that won't send you to